Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing Norm Van Eeden Petersman. He is Strongtown's Director of Movement Building. He is a community leader, advocate, and soccer coach in his home city of Delta in British Columbia. He is an expert speaker, unlike myself. I've already used too many ums to be one of those. He is our guide tonight on escaping the housing trap. Please join me in welcoming Norm Van Eeden Petersman.
Thank you, Hans. All right, good evening. It is great to be with you, and I'm putting my timer here just so I keep myself on track. It's a great privilege to be up in San Luis Obispo for the first time and to be able to spend time in a city where I was warned ahead of time that you like to make many clever puns on the idea of being slow and yet really being up for it and being interested in continuing to improve your community. And so with that, I'm so grateful for this opportunity to present on a vexing problem that we all face. A few people said, oh, you know, must be significant to have almost a full house tonight. And I said, yes, because the problem is that large. We need this many people to involve themselves in addressing this gripping, wicked problem that we have in our communities, that we've been caught in a housing trap. And so I've created a resource page for you, and it'll be posted later as well towards the end of the talk, if you're interested in learning more, as well as continuing to understand a little bit more about Strongtowns. The Strongtowns organization is a 501c3, and we're headquartered in the wonderful place of Brainerd, Minnesota. But we have advocates and adherents all over the world now of people that are taking note of the fact that we have done something to our cities and our towns and even our villages and small communities that is making them weak and fragile, and we seek to change that. And so as we talk about housing, it is clearly interwoven with a bigger challenge that we face in our cities, which is a looming insolvency, a growing debt, a growing lack of opportunities that we are creating through the systems that we have perpetuated across North America. We say in Strongtown's lingo that we are faced with the illusion of wealth. We have generated over the last 40, 50 years a significant amount of outward prosperity, and yet we lack the means to build lasting prosperity, and this is becoming increasingly clear. And it's having a profound impact on the way that we house people, the way that we dignify people on our city streets, the way in which we provide opportunities for people, even the way that we confront the challenge of can we invite more participants into what we are doing, and the great fissures that are growing as a consequence of many people saying, maybe we can't. Maybe we don't have what it takes as a civilization, as a people, to actually be a welcoming and inclusive place. And a lot of that is emerging out of some of these core symptoms that we are identifying. And the good news is that we can change this. The bad news, or the bleak news, is that this talk, I often say, is about making things just a little less worse. It is not necessarily going to be that you walk out and you're like, wow, we've got ourselves the perfect silver bullet. Instead, we are trying to identify how do we provide housing in places where that housing has become scarce, expensive, and hotly contested. And from every conversation that I've had already this day in San Luis Obispo, this is clearly an indication of the challenge that you're facing. It's what the local conversation group has stepped up to try to address this challenge, Better SLO. So many additional parties are working at this vexing problem that we face. If you're interested, the name of the presentation comes from a book that was written by two of my colleagues at Strongtowns, Daniel Herricus and Chuck Marone. And I want to draw attention to the fact that the publisher said, hey, you say Strongtowns response. Can we amp that up a bit, sell a few more copies? Let's call it the Strongtowns solution to the housing crisis. And if you spend any time with Strongtowns, you realize we are allergic to the idea that there's a single solution or even a simple set of just unlock a few things and then everything will be fine. There is no silver bullet. There is instead this calculated requirement for us to really dive into the deep, deep underlying contributing factors to what has gotten us into this place and take this on. A key element of this that I want to perhaps not introduce tonight, but certainly give you more color to this concept, is the idea that we need to allow the next increment of development to be allowed in every neighborhood across America by right. This means, and I'll outline a little bit more of what that means, but this is a concept that is at odds with the standards of the suburban experiment. A nationwide, continent-wide experiment in building communities in a way that is very different than what our ancestors did over thousands of years. We're not just hearkening back like, oh, we want the good old days. No, we are saying, what is it that is necessary to build lasting prosperity in communities that use scarce resources well, that manage to integrate additional populations in without becoming stretched or stressed, and find new ways to build and contribute to an enduring prosperity in the fullest sense of the person. The fullest sense of the person means that you feel prosperous in being in luxurious public spaces that are designed as wonderful spaces where you feel dignified, welcomed, and able to be integrated into your community. A prosperity of relationship with people of high status, of low status, all across the board. All of these different things are key to this challenge, and we have instead really messed this up through the standards that we've established across our communities. And so our core message, and one that I hope resonates with you, is that our current path, which was really, truly, in the modernist spirit, meant as a path to prosperity, has instead unwittingly trapped us in a system that is incapable of building lasting prosperity. And in response to this, we need to return to the pattern of local, but especially iterative actions. Testing, probing, trialing different things rather than committing ourselves to 40-year master plans or 60-year master plans. I was just in Santa Barbara chatting with the local conversation leader there who actually went to the home of the 80-year-old authors of a plan for the growth and then the capping of growth of Santa Barbara. And they identified that if the population exceeded 70,000 people, the city would collapse, it would become unlivable, and therefore a population cap of 68,000 was required, as well as a cap on the number of jobs. You can see a very prescriptive, a very ordered, a very modern idea that if we just get the inputs right, we will get the outputs that we need, and then we just leave everything alone. Heaven forbid that Newton's second law comes back to haunt us. No, we'll just ignore those standards of gravity, those standards of the forces that exist in our communities. And so what we say is we need to come back to this practice of identifying how can we, through thousands of small experiments in thousands of communities across North America and other parts of the world, really recapture what it is to sustain local prosperity. Housing is a prosperity problem as much as homelessness is a housing problem. It is about the capacity to make your way and improve your life as well as the lives of others without it coming at their expense. And this is what we see as a key part of our challenge. Because, let me know afterwards if you think that this is an uncontested principle in our communities. We hold forth and we coach city leaders to look at their code, to look at their standards, to actually say, do you allow each neighborhood to change? But do you also do things that allow them not to be subject to radical change? Instead, in so many of our cities, we reserve entire enclaves as being exclusive, frozen in amber, and then we turn around and we say, but we'll allow growth over here, and then we wonder why there's massive displacement, insane gentrification, all of the challenges that come with it. In addition to that, I will use a very vivid image and then also a less vivid image. We're dealing with pimples and volcanoes. What do I mean by that? If you continue to suppress the need of your skin to breathe, and if you continue to suppress the natural forces bubbling up in the ground, you will get volcanoes and you will get pimples. And that is often what we see in our cities when we get tall and sprawl. We get the continuation of a one pattern of housing, the standard, the norm, the only thing that's accepted. And then we have to make room for the exception, the one that squeezes through, the second big project that somebody threatens to sue unless they get through. They create the tension, they create the pressure, they create the financial conditions for a significant windfall, and then they get it, and it feels like a pimple does. Not something that we want in our lives. And so for those that are eating, my apologies. We'll move on to the question of how did we get here, and what do we mean by ourselves being in a trap? And to help illustrate this, I want to talk about the agriculture trap. Yuval Noah Harari is really good on this sort of narrative of what happened when our ancestors, who were hunter-gatherers, were able to sustain a population by spearing bison and taking on other types of finding blueberries wherever they happen to be, and doing the core things that were necessary to be hunters and gatherers. And in this context, there was a young man, and he discovered that if he cultivated a blueberry bush, that it would actually produce a little bit more fruit. And he said, I kind of like this. And somebody else discovered barley and was like, oh, I can make something good with this called beer, and it's going to make my life better. And out of this, you get the shift from being hunter-gatherers over time. More and more of our societies began to shift to becoming agriculturalists. And so the agricultural revolution resulted in the ability to grow more food without having to follow your food, which allowed for more permanent settlements. Aside from the West Coast where the salmon would come to us, in the rest of the world, much of the rest of the world, there was the obligation to go find your food, continue to follow it. And in this context, the agricultural revolution allowed for the establishment of cities, and you see this sudden shift in the amount of populations that were sustained. The development pattern began to shift rapidly as people began to concentrate in areas because food could be grown in abundance for them, and the result was an increased population. With this, it also required greater food sources. And so the continued refinement of irrigation and other practices like this gave rise to the ability to have an even larger population. The trap is, at some point, a critical point in this path, you can no longer go back. At some point down this path, you can no longer go back to being a hunter-gatherer society unless you cull a significant percentage of your population. And that is not something that any mother or any father or any person would want to see happen. And so in this context, you are, in a sense, stuck, and you need to now live with the consequences that if droughts come, you as agriculturalists have to adapt to it, have to address that challenge. And it's much the same way in what we have done with our housing system as we relate the need between having housing as shelter and finding so much benefit in actually addressing and using housing as an investment tool, as a tool for building wealth much more rapidly than one would expect within the context of what we've done. And the way that we did this is we began to rewire the operating systems of our cities. We began to rewire the operating systems of our cities so that they would become capable of being much more ordered, much more structured, much more predictable, and out of this we could see significant growth. This would be through very predictable standards, through the production, the mass production of housing, many different types of things like this. And it emerged through policy, it emerged through subsidies, it emerged through restrictive lending within the more chaotic, messy communities, often racially defined communities, while simultaneously opening up the floodgates for the continued replication of a pattern of development in the suburbs that gave rise to a whole new development pattern. It was a trading of a dramatically simplified method of building out our cities, and now we face the fact that we are so deeply committed to this pattern. The question is, can we actually come back from this? And is there any need to? Should we, is an open question. But we have traded a vision and an understanding of our cities as being complex organisms that are best suited to a person who has the mindset of like a conservation biologist. That says if there is a 3-spotted toad in that pool there, that's a good indicator that something healthy is going on. But if you have some other invasive creature over here, we need to address that. We need to try to change some of the core features of our communities, our ecosystems. We need to tweak it. We need to refine it. We need to observe it and watch. And instead, what our methods began to produce was the ability to simply build complicated. Cities are no doubt complicated. Go ask your technical professionals in your city building community or the city building professions. They will have to explain all their acronyms. They'll have to explain all their systems, all their complicated measurements. But there's something that is lacking of that organic sort of emergent, dynamic growth within our communities. Let me give you an example. A large-scale developer comes in with a proposal for 1,000 homes, as in Santa Clarita, where I just was, right next to the Six Flags. For some reason, they've neglected to put any commercial, any retail in a development of 1,000 homes, which is probably a population of about 3,000 people that would be moving onto that site. where in a town you would have rapidly the emergence of a lot of different types of uses, a lot of different types of things that would serve that type of a community. Instead, they said, we have a product, and the city is obliged to approve it. And in fact, when we roll out the filing cabinet, we have every little form that they require, every little survey that they need, every parking model that they can demand of us. Meanwhile, if your Uncle Bob says, hey, I think I'm going to start a barber shop in the garage, on the second floor of the garage. Goes into the city hall and they're like, wait a minute, get in line. And then get in line and, oh, you don't have that form, come back tomorrow. They go through this process and it's almost as if, what are you doing? Give us the complicated but regular. Don't do anything that's messy. Don't do anything that's one of a kind. And if we have architects in the room, some of you are really good at doing just the complicated repeat, repeat, repeat. But when you have that moment of like internal crisis, like, am I just, you're churning out something that's the same thing over and over again? Where is the room for creativity? Where's the room for that which my turtleneck produces? What is it that we can do to create something vibrant, beautiful, and delightful and lovable in our places? Notice back in, and again, this is at risk of being nostalgic, but like back in the day, before the end of the Second World War, our communities would emerge with a mix of sizes and uses, thousands of different hands participating in the process of building out our communities. You have complexity in this space. This is Grand Rapids, Michigan, but if I hadn't told you, you might have thought it was somewhere else. You notice that there's a premium on using the lots that are closer to the established core of the community. You use what land you have available to you, you put it and make it more productive. Think of farmers, when they have their land available to them, they are very conscious of the fact they want to increase the amount of productive capacity of each acre that they have in order to be able to succeed in a very difficult, challenging environment. When you have scarce resources, you want to use them really effectively. And this is what we see modeled in cities, not only in North America, but all around the world. And in fact, in many places, even still today, with really clear outcomes. And you see the incremental growth and adaptation. We can see this little hut here that drives some of the city planners or the zoners in our communities mad. Why is that there? Where's the setbacks? Where's all the rules? What about the fire risk? All of those things. But in the context, this is where you put Uncle Frank, because you didn't want him to be around the kids. Because he snores, that's why. He snores, he's a bit grumpy. But in this context, you would adapt. You would immediately respond to local needs as they came up. Here's San Luis Obispo. Same thing, we're seeing this emergence. Rapidly, you would see the replacement of some of the structures that maybe an earthquake knocks over or a fire takes out a couple of structures. And next thing you know, in response to that local need, you would build it back a little bit bigger. You would build it back with a little bit more intensity if the local needs were there. You would respond with greater complexity. Things didn't have to be the same, and they could be rather dynamic. You would incrementally grow and adapt them. There's just so many different things. We can see that the clustering of places within our community and the continued development of our places. So what changed? How did we go from, in a sense, a version of being hunter-gatherers, figuring it out in a rather chaotic, messy way, of establishing wealth within communities and cultivating that wealth within it, to then replacing it with a much different system? A key culprit in this, though I'll add a little bit of color to this description, is the Great Depression. So after the Roaring 20s, you get into a situation where many people had been able to set aside enough funds with limited term mortgages to be able to buy their own homes. Every couple of years, they would have a balloon payment that they had to make. They would either make that or take out a fresh loan, and they would come back and basically continue to be able to be in their homes. But once you remove their income earning capacity, suddenly they could not make their payments. And as they would come to the bank would say, I need you to be able to make this payment, and if you can't, I'm taking your home. The trouble was, those homes suddenly became worth less and less and less and less, which meant that even if you had a mortgage for your home, you were now taking out or holding onto a mortgage that was worth more than the actual property that you had as more homes came onto the market. And what was quickly realized is that the banks are going to lose their shirt, people are going to be out of their homes, there's going to be a run on the markets, and we need to step in to intervene. This was happening with farms, this was happening with homes, and in this context, the federal government stepped up and they said, look, if we backstop mortgages, we extend the amount of time that you can borrow, and we assure the banks that if you make a loan, we will take that loan onto our books so that you can continue to make loans, but we will continue to backstop it. We will assure that housing prices don't drop. And as FDR said, we have taken the most important step to prevent this deflationary spiral of home values so that we can keep people in their homes and keep them with equity, with title in their properties. And this was a necessary, and I would submit, a good response. It was an emergency act that made a direct contribution to bringing the United States through a period of remarkable disruption. And in this context, then, you go into World War II, but there had already been recovery occurring. But now you go off to World War II. The economy rebounds. There's a great need for steel. All of the different factories are producing armaments and tanks and all of these types of things. But what the war planners in the US Department of Defense, as well as the Economics Department, understood is that if the war were to end suddenly, which they expected because they could see that Germany was weakening or the Axis forces were weakening, the Allies were picking up steam after D-Day, that there was an understanding if the war ends suddenly, there will be this massive demobilization and industrial dislocation, as no longer do we have to build tanks or bombs or all of those things. And in this context, it will be the greatest disruption in what will happen. We're just going back to where we were. We're going back to the situation where we have people without access to jobs, without access to income, requiring something of the state and yet not being able to contribute to it. There will be a run on capital, and in this context, we will get social revolution, we will get distress, and we will get collapse. And so there was a realization that what they had done to correct after or during the Great Depression, to backstop homes and use homes and the development of new communities as a way of securing places, that this could actually be an accelerant for a community and an accelerant for a government and an accelerant for a nation. If you make it easier for more people to borrow more money, to pay more for housing, you begin to do things like you extend your lending term, bringing more people in from the sidelines. You also, in this period right after the Second World War, we see this opening up of so much more land with the assurance that not just you're going to go out and be a sharecropper or you're going to go out and be a pioneer, you're going to go out into newly formed communities and enjoy the services that are subsidized for you. Again, not everyone, because we have all sorts of exclusionary practices, racially based practices that prevented certain folks from being able to do this, but many others were able to go out. And critically, in order for this to succeed, you had to deter the alternatives. During the wars, as well as during the Great Depression, much of the maintenance, the regular sort of keeping up of the grand buildings in our cities began to flag. And yet, rather than pouring resources into that work, making our cities habitable and continuing to cultivate the capital within them to actually boost their value, instead we said, let's have that money go out. Let's have that money go away. And so as a result, the cities became less livable because the core standards were not being maintained, while at the same time, the deterrence of that alternative to the suburb was basically allowing the suburbs to begin to spread rapidly. And another key contributor was the highway spending that was now unlinked from local budgets, which meant that a highway project did not need to be justified as to how much value it would bring to a local community. Instead, it was much more amorphous, much broader, and as a result, all of this opened up land, created entirely new communities, and it was a remarkable and exceptional growth machine. It employed so many people. It put so many people into home ownership. It provided pathways for so many people to participate in this process. And notice how different this is from the pictures of the incremental development that you would see of our traditional cities, where you would, yes, see some collections of huts and shacks and things like this on the outskirts of a community, but much of the growth would rapidly intensify. Much of the growth, you would rapidly take your wooden shack and you would turn it into a brick building, and then you would lease out the second floor as a boarding room, and you would do those types of adaptations. But here, in the context, not just in Leventon, but elsewhere, the recognition was those things are a risk to the continued development of suburban tracts. And so as a result, many of the modern zoning standards began to be implemented to tamp down on anything which would disrupt the rapid replication of the same thing. And so what does this look like in Fresno? In the days of the traditional development pattern, you see a core that is developing, that is thickening up, that is maturing. This is very normal. This is what we see in the annexation histories of most of our major cities across North America. 1934, even in the midst of a depression, they're still starting to add more neighborhoods, but they're continuing to be confined. They're restrained. If you were to look at the population numbers as well as the densification of the city, it's keeping in pace with this. Even during the war years, they're still constructing additional neighborhoods, but notice it's modest, and much of the growth is happening in the cities, developing the land that has been developed so that it grows in intensity and in productive land use. Now 1958 comes along, and we see sudden rapid outward expansion. 1970 continues to boost this. 1983, another massive wave, continuing to build out. 1995 up until 2010. And I would imagine if we grab the newest slides, this would take us even further. And this is actually something, I don't have a graphic, so I just have to show you a very confusing squiggly lines. That's San Luis Obispo, but there's a whole, I think it's 3 pages of annexation history of the times when the city continued to grow and add more to its boundaries, add more to its boundaries. I was just down in Santa Barbara, and I learned about the fact that they annexed their airport, which is like ways away. If you haven't read the story of it, it's fascinating, but I won't go into it tonight. But this was that releasing of that natural evolution of our core cities and basically forcing it outwards, forcing it to go horizontal. And the consequence of this, the question of this, is what does this do to our cities? And what does it do to the cost of housing? And what does it do to the cost of providing services to these places? Our friends at Urban 3, which is a fantastic analytics firm, did this study in Kansas City. You have the 1910 population up to 2010, a 1.8 times increase in population. They grow. But in that time, the question is, how much did it cost to grow? That is, if you had Jimmy, and Jimmy is in Kansas City in 1910, he needs 1 foot of pipe per person. Or say you need 1 foot, you need a foot, and you need a foot for the things that come out of your toilet. But by 2010, you need each of you 27 feet. Imagine putting that in your backpack every time that you had to go out the door. You could put a foot-long pipe, but you can't take 27 feet with you. Obviously, you're not trying to do that, but you do have to pay for it. Out of the same pockets, you have to cover the cost for that. South Bend, Indiana is even more pronounced, where they experience a negative population decline. Sorry, a positive population decline, if I get my mixed negatives and positives right. Minus 22%, there you go. And in that context, their obligation to lift water and sewage grew from 3 lift stations in the city to provide for a population of 132,000 to then, by going horizontal, they increased the infrastructure bill massively by 1,333%. My mind doesn't even know how to think about that. 43 lift stations, and similarly, miles of force main explodes in this context. And the question is, how much of that can you fit in your backpack as you go to work to earn enough money to be able to cover the costs of this as you've developed this? And so the result of this is that our cities, which first had substantial cash reserves because they had a productive land use pattern, increasingly had to then turn to bond markets in order to cover the replacement of core infrastructure, as well as the gradual addition of new infrastructure to cover all of that horizontal growth. How many of your community centers that have been built on the outskirts of town are actually fully funded or actually being paid for with cash? You say, oh, no, we're just borrowing from future generations. We are borrowing into the future, an intergenerational dine and dash, so that we get to experience the fruits of our pleasure right now, and yet we are subjecting future generations for the continuing obligation to cover the cost of this. We were just in Norman, Oklahoma. They built a $67 million library. Unfortunately, they picked a really fancy architect who didn't ensure through the construction methods that the roof didn't leak. They not only destroyed their entire library collection with black mold, they also subjected themselves to significant liabilities because of health risks to the staff. And this $67 million thing is now an albatross, but the bonding agencies still require their payment. Now, that's a sign of mismanagement. You could say, oh, that could happen to anybody. But this is the challenge. We've actually begun to do this to ourselves, and we are sliding into insolvency in more and more of our communities. I had a chat with a builder from Wisconsin who gave me a call at Strong Towns, and he said, is Strong Towns a cult? And I was like, all right, I need to know. I was a pastor for 10 years, so I'm very aware that like, I don't want to be in a cult. You know, it's not good for my marriage. It's not good for my wallet. Let's figure this out. So I'm like, what do you want about, Tim? He said, I've been a builder. I've noticed the way that when I was building things, it was always modest, very simple structures at the water treatment plant, or I would go in and help the library build a small little, addition, things like this. He said, I turned my business over to my son, and he does great projects, incredible projects. He said, I'm proud of him on one side because he's doing well. The other side, he's like, I'm in the middle of Wisconsin, and we are building stuff with borrowed money. We're building stuff with federal money. We're building stuff that we are obligated to maintain. And he said, I don't know where this money is going to come from. And his line that I've quoted here is, we've lost sight of what it takes to build lasting prosperity. And there is wisdom in this, and this is having a significant impact on when we have messed with our housing market, when we have messed with our ability to actually provide the types of housing that we need in response to local demands. It is exacerbating the problem that we have created with our development pattern in the way that we are wasteful. And so at Strong Towns, if you're interested, an article that really came on the radar of many people was America's Growth Ponzi Scheme. It is a Ponzi scheme that is being carried out across our communities, and this is something that we are trying to raise the alarm. Again, trying to make things a little less worse, trying to help people before the bottom falls out. And what I've mentioned the suburban experiment a couple times, but let's talk about what I mean by this. It is a radical departure from the traditional development pattern. It is, in one way you could say, it's a big, big bet that we can do something that our ancestors never did, and we can get away with it and prosper. And for a time, it seemed like it was coming up good, that the dice had been rolled and it was going to be fantastic. There was, I remember the kitchen table debate between Khrushchev and Nixon. And Nixon is able to say, we've got dishwashers in every home. We have a wonderful prosperity for the middle class. We have a large middle class, which now today we would love to have as we see the growing inequities in our communities. And in this context, one of the things that was fueling this was the locking of neighborhoods in a state of perpetual adolescence. Now, I have a 10-year-old. I'm excited to get him through the teenage years as fast as I can. The last thing I want to do is lock him in that stage, and yet we've done this with so many of our communities. Just down in Santa Barbara, I was actually chatting with Sully, who's the leader there, and he said, you can go and you can see the downtown, obviously, has a lot of dynamic activity. It has 4-story, 8-story structures that are there. A lot of that activity occurred in the 1920s, 1930s, rebuilding after the earthquake, all of that economic generative activity that continues to build prosperity in the community. And then as the community began to broaden, there was, because it was still part of a traditional development pattern, a lot of activity to intensify new cores. There were new little areas that began to emerge as retail sectors, as areas of new gathering spaces. But he said you can almost see it like in a time capsule, that the moment that we switched gears into a totally new mode, those things got locked in amber. You still go, they might have a nice facade, but the back is still the plywood and the wooden structures that are in the first life cycle of a building's project development phase, and yet we've maintained that. We keep them frozen in that state. This is a picture out of my neighborhood in Delta, BC. Aside from the trees being a little bit taller and one house being squeezed into the middle, otherwise virtually everything is the same as it was from the 1970s. Entire neighborhoods being built all at once into a finished state. In contrast, the traditional development pattern consists of assemblies of increasingly independent neighborhoods. This is really critical to the way in which we build our communities and what it takes for us to bring that back, to really benefit from proximity, to really realize the true unlocking of value of co-location in our places, responding to local pressure by capitalizing on proximity through incremental responses, ongoing adaptation to local pressure that allows us to really respond in real time rather than suppressing it for a long time until you get a volcano or a pimple. Instead, what we need is active adaptation to what is taking place in our communities. Because we need to really view our systems as those that are capable of correction along the way, that can move up and down through an equilibrium with quite a bit of frequency. And yet, the suburban experiment is marked by 3 hallmarks that I would identify: resistance to change, exclusion by class or status, and mandatory car ownership, or the assumption of auto-dependency. And in this context, we've woven it into our design standards, into our building codes. My city has an official community plan where I love the first 8 pages. I'm like, oh yes, and I can hear the heavens open. We're going to be a wonderful city, walkable, like, inviting, and then the rest of the code takes it all away. It's sort of like, Voldemort shows up and all the light disappears and you're like, what just happened? And it's still baked into our code. And you're like, we are doing things actively to continue to propagate the idea that we should resist all change, exclude by class, and have mandatory or the assumption of auto-dependency in our places. And the consequence of this is strangling exclusion in many of our desirable cities, as well as rolling blight in most other places. Because our neighborhoods are changing. This is a line that I use with older folks as well as younger folks in our community all the time. I'll say that you can't just have a no change option. Although many people campaign on that, or many people insist on that, or post vociferously on Facebook, I don't want any more change, no more of this. It doesn't work that way. So, will your community become more expensive and exclusive? Or will it actually become more inclusive and diverse? Will you allow the change that actually does occur to be of more value and bring more benefit to the whole community? Like I said, we've traded a robust, incremental approach for a complicated and fragile pattern of suburban-style development. We can characterize it as cookie-cutter development, which sometimes is an aesthetic judgment. Joni Mitchell, little boxes on the hillside made of ticky-tack. That is actually not the argument that we want to be putting forward. We don't find that aesthetic argument to be persuasive. But the question is, what have we done to the system? What have we done to the core capacity of our communities to adapt and change as we need to? And again, the political demands of this type of development is still low taxes per acre and the provision of equal service, even if you live at some significant distance from where those services are being provided. We have I won't even go, but now, just briefly to illustrate this, and I could do the exact same numbers with residences, but then one of you would notice that I picked your house and I'd get run out of here. So I'm going to do this with retail tonight. And we're going to talk about the value per acre of various sites within our communities. And because the San Luis Obispo County Assessor has a horribly complicated website, or at least it was above my pay grade, I couldn't do the numbers in San Luis Obispo. I spent about an hour today trying to get these numbers. So bear with me, these are from Santa Barbara, which I'm told in some circles is like an insult to bring anything up to here, but you guys are cool. So let's talk. On State Street, this is a 0.1 acre site. And it has, the property, the 2-story structure there is worth $2.5 million. In a sense, not bad for California. But in that context, if you ask how much value is stored on a per acre basis, I have a farming background, so I want to think, like, if I have one big field and a small field, and I get 10 bales from the big field, and I get 8 bales from the small field, I might go home to my wife and see, like, hey, the big field outdid the small field. But then if she says, yeah, but the big field is like 8 times larger than the small field, so really you should do more of what you did to make the small field productive, you would realize, oh, that's what we mean by a productive land use pattern. And notice, so 25 million, let's have that as sort of our standard. And even though sales tax matters, property tax actually does a pretty decent job of being a proxy for the amount of productive capacity that you see in sales tax. We can show you the numbers that they work out. And this is a tax bill being delivered to the city of $287,000 per acre on an annual basis. How do we get nice things in our community? We take from the pool of private wealth that we have in our community, and we take a fraction of that to be able to provide for the common wealth, for the common good. And I would say it depends on your political stripes how much of a fraction you want that to be, but there has to be private prosperity in order for there to be public prosperity as well. Now, in this context, another structure just around the corner, a 0.12 acre site, you can see, even as we have a slightly more expensive site because it's on a slightly larger lot, $22.6 million per acre, but still there's a healthy, generous sort of prosperity that's captured here. This is a structure in part because it's on a very small lot size. It actually, and because of its location, is $43.5 million per acre. But now let's change the development pattern. Let's change the development pattern to the very thing that the suburban experiment said, let's make this easy to borrow for. Let's make this easy for out-of-state real estate investors to basically say, oh, we want a mall there, we want a mall there, we want all of these things. How's it doing on a value per acre basis? $4.4 million per acre. That is a 10x decrease in the amount of productive capacity being generated on these 8.79 acres. I was up in Kirkland, Washington, the home of Costco, and their Costco pays 1/14 the amount of property tax per acre that their little downtown organic grocer does. And I said, it's no wonder that people want their supersized Costco muffins, and because they're like, oh, the prices are so great, but it's because you've subsidized it. And in my city, McDonald's, our little McDonald's pays 1/7 the amount of property tax per acre that our local coffee shop does. And I'm like, how much do I love the culinary delight of the McGriddle that I'm willing to subsidize it to such an extent? And so you see what I'm saying here. This is a challenge that when we change the development pattern, like Tim from Wisconsin said, we lose sight of what it takes to build lasting prosperity. This is the IHOP in Santa Barbara, again, on State Street on that same stretch, down to $3.6 million per acre because it's an inefficient land use pattern. The consequence of this is that we insist at Strong Towns that streets for residences, as well as in our retail areas, must serve as platforms for building wealth. This is why we want to make them safe. This is why we want to make them livable. This is why we want street trees on every street, because this is what it takes for them to succeed in actually serving as platforms for building wealth. We can see this over decades or millennia of human habitat, and we've lost sight of this when we strip away the trees, we remove these types of things, and even when we start to dilute rather than concentrate the activity that's needed to build wealth. Just by including all of that off-street parking in that site, it begins to dilute and degrade what is capable of being produced on that site. You might say, well, it's a good thing for all that parking to be provided, but it's parking on private land, it's on private property that is not being put to productive use. The reason the McDonald's pays 1/7 the amount of property tax is because the vast majority of their land is devoted to a very low productive use, land use pattern, the storage and movement of cars. So what if we begin to alter that? We can even filter it onto city streets. We can do that type of thing. And as a result, we would continue to boost what we're doing. Here's your, I believe this is the Walmart or one of the big box stores that you have, sort of the complexes. And the question is, how much more productive is your downtown in San Luis Obispo? How much more productive is this pattern? And how do we come back to having this? I'm going to move on from Nassim Taleb. No one should really move on from him. He's got some brilliant things to say. But let's talk specifically about how this system, a very complicated but very structured approaches to providing housing in our markets, has really altered the fabric of our communities as well as our society. This is a chart of national house prices over the decades. And I ask the question, or say, complex systems have means of correction that bring us back to an equilibrium. This is adjusted by inflation for current day dollars. And in this context, one of the things that we have is that we've seen this run up in prices. And this is consistent with a switch from viewing housing as shelter, where all housing types are needed in rapid, fluid responses to local needs. I said that Uncle Frank is going to move into the shed between the house and the garage. You're going to do that in response to local need because you need to house someone. You're going to do the types of adaptations where you say, well, our structure is not adequate, I've got to replace the roof, but if I'm replacing the roof, why don't I lift it an extra story and I've got an additional unit that I can either rent out or bring another family member in. I can do all these types of things so that change increases opportunities. In contrast, housing as investment relies on predictable financial units that are predicated on persistent scarcity to maximize value. And change threatens the bottom line. There are dozens, I believe it's 140 projects in Vancouver right now that are stalled, that are not moving forward because our interest rate went up by 2 index points. Or not 2 index points, 2 percentages. Again, math is not my strong suit. But in this context, what is it that has happened? They say, well, we need our returns. And those returns are at 25% margins or 12, at least 12, if not all the way up to 25% margins. And so we have the carrying capacity that the moment we will not get premium prices, we hold our projects. This is very much because change threatens the bottom line. Even the introduction of more housing by other participants is hotly contested. How many times have you seen one housing developer actually sabotage the success opportunities of other types of development? How many times do you see the standards being upheld by the very same people that benefit most from them? And in this context, we know that this has had a significant, profound impact in what we're doing. And how are we doing? Well, we had a bubble in 2008. Then we had a crash. Then we had the recovery. Well, I would say it's like a recovery as it just takes off. And you can see the brief blip in 2022. Again, as a renter, I pray, not every day, but most days, Lord, please make the housing market crash so that I can get into a house. 75% would be great, and 80% would be wonderful. But I love people that would be devastated by this. I love people that basically would be culled in the hunter-gatherer to agriculture trap by this consequence. They would be decimated by such a shift. And in that context, I feel deeply that, like, on the one hand, I need something to change, but on the other hand, they are so exposed they cannot experience change without being ruined by it. And so here we sit, seeing no change, no ability to return back to a state of equilibrium in this context. Like I said, complex systems need to be able to be corrected. And housing is expensive. I love this meme, the idea of, like, it's time to celebrate. And who gets to celebrate? Who benefits from high house prices? Local governments, state governments, federal governments, homeowners, banks and insurance companies, developers, contractors, land speculators, realtors, pension funds, and none of them are true villains, are they? You want, if you have a pension, you want it to actually be okay. You want to be able to see realtors still doing their job. You want your homeowners, if it's your mother or your friend, you know that they have a vested interest in your community. You know that they benefit, but who doesn't? Are the people that have learned what a pitchfork is. Renters and the poor. And we are sowing the seeds of a deep social disruption. And the thing is, we've done this to ourselves. This class of people who are renting and poor is growing and becoming increasingly desperate, squeezed, and struggling deeply. My rent just went up $500 a month, up to $2,700 a month, which probably for San Luis Obispo rates might be actually kind of a deal. But in this context, I said, and we got half the amount of space that we previously had for a three-bedroom house or three-bedroom home, and way more anxiety, way more stress. And we're struggling, we're deeply experiencing this. And in this context, we wonder, what can we do about it? And the realization is that so many of what we rely on as shelter, Malthus's hierarchy of needs, we need shelter as one of our core priorities. But in this context, we've turned housing into financial products. The main one being the single-family home, as well as the 5/1. These are financial products that can be replicated at scale. And what does this look like? What is the features of this trap that we're in? You can get investment for tract housing. If you're a production builder, you can go and get you can get significant investors to come in, basically make this possible. The whole system is predicated to flowing a ton of money into this. We even provide a ton of tax breaks and incentives and all of these types of things to make this possible. We give commitments. We will build schools out to wherever you go and do this type of development. We will follow with the services. Trust us, it'll be there, even if it comes at the cost of inner cities, community centers, and other things that we simultaneously are closing down, deeming them excess to requirements. The other thing that's easy to get money for right now are these types of projects. You have a token amount of affordable housing woven in, and basically you just check enough boxes, you roll out your filing cabinet with all of the same things that you used in Albuquerque, in Spokane, and in San Luis Obispo, and you go through the process. The group that doesn't have as much capital, although ironically they have a ton of capital, but are not rapidly building out entirely new neighborhoods all at once, are those that are super wealthy. But they're managing just fine. I think Jeff Bezos and his crew are going to be okay, I'm pretty sure. But the folks that are not are the ones that we need to be providing the most for. This is the small home. This is that first inkling, the first ladder, not the 2,500 or now 3,500 square foot home that is now the common standard by which we deem the first level or the starter home to be present. It means a 500 square foot house, a 600 square foot house, redefining what a home is so that a home is not just a unit when it's in an apartment, but a home when it's in a neighborhood. All of these are homes and all of these are needed, and we need to get back to what our ancestors knew. Instinctively, you build a shack first. And somebody moves into that shack and lives in it until they might have an opportunity to move out of it. This looks like taking existing homes. We have more bedrooms than are needed. So we actually, I like the phrase that we don't have a housing, or we don't have a housing shortage, we have a housing shortage, but we don't have a bedroom shortage, is the line. Because there are excessive bedrooms available all over, but If you want to put in an accessory apartment, one, the front door, there can only be one front door. Two, you cannot enter 2 units through the same front door. It's not possible. 3, the design standard says you must have the parking at the curb or some other place. And you create the conditions in which it becomes almost impossible for, say, a retiree to say, we can take a portion of our home, that's where we will live, and the remainder of it we turn into a home that's available for someone else. The accessory apartment for the person that we should make a commonplace. The retiree that is renting out a significant portion of their home because they found an easier way for them to live in an accessory or a utility apartment in their community. Backyard cottages, Chuck really insists on this. I keep slipping into calling them accessory dwelling units. He's like, that sounds like something you get on like your medical bill, like at the bottom there's like a mysterious charge for an ADU. In that context, like he's like, make it clear that this is just normal. This is a backyard cottage. This is a home for yet another person. And I like to call this like stealth density. The waking up in the morning and realizing like, holy smokes, there's somebody living in my backyard and they're paying me rent. And actually that's kind of a cool little spot that they've created back there. And the starter house, the simple modest structure. And again, in many of our cities, it's not going to look like this. It's going to look like a townhouse. It's going to look like units where the front of the unit is the one that sells for more and the back of the unit is the one that sells for less. It's the little units on top of our retail settings and our commercial strips, all of these different types of things. Because the challenge that we've created for ourselves is that the iconic starter home is dead as a doornail. In many of our markets. This is a chart showing a house available for purchase under $250,000. And I'm like, that hasn't been the case in these markets in a long, long time. This has profound consequences for us, that it's so many multiples of your annual household income that you cannot qualify and you're stuck. And this is a consequence of what we've done to ourselves. And I know I'm at 50 minutes and I haven't even talked about some of the core solutions. So we will get to this in a moment because we've lost our way. And there's a lot more in the book. A key part of it is we need to tackle our zoning laws. There's already groups that are active at this. They need more allies, more participants in this process, allowing for a greater diversity of housing types and densities to increase the supply of entry-level housing. There are gaps still within our existing fabric where we should be encouraging what I like to call no assembly required development. That is, if it's already been set aside as housing lands, it should be allowed to have more housing. And it should be allowed to have more housing at the next increment. This is an experiment an example that my colleague Edward laid out. He said he was demonstrating to city officials there's so much land that's actually available. You'll hear people, and people have told me this in San Luis Obispo, we're built out. Well, I saw places you could build. I saw backyards where you could build. I saw side yards where you could build. There's no sense that we are built out. You just have to get at it. Get started, remove some of the gates to doing this. We need to incentivize small. This is remarkable that if you can bring down your square footage, even if your cost to build is high, on a per square footage basis, it's not the same thing when you build 3,500 square feet versus when you build 750. We also are warning against some of the fetishization of tiny homes. It's like, oh, it's cute. It's something you can do for a YouTube stream for a little while. There is value in it. We have traditionally in human history lived in small places, but we should not so fetishize even the backyard cottage. It should be part of this big mix of things beginning to emerge. We actually would say there's some great examples how to do this also with small scale retail, and there's so much more that needs to be done. I could summarize some of our proposals and policy prescriptions under removing suburban aversions to complex adaptation. In fact, this would be what I would ask you to take away as the takeaway from tonight, that if you have the ability to spot those suburban aversions to complex or chaotic adaptations of our existing communities. And I just had, actually last night in Santa Barbara, we were in a bar and there was a guy that was there for the karaoke. Turns out he also showed up for a housing talk. And he was a retired building inspector and he said, oh, I liked a lot of what you said, but I mean, we can't just throw out the code. And I said, no, we need safety standards, absolutely. He said, oh, well then I agree with everything you said. I was like, all right, hey, check it out, become a Strong Towns member. But what we need to guard against are those things that are rooted in strategic exclusion by class or status. In Vancouver, they forbid, in the vast majority of the lands, the inclusion, even in the retail corridors, they forbid the presence of laundries. Not because the people of Vancouver are so spectacularly clean that they never need to clean themselves. No, it's because they were Chinese owned. And so they were based on low status peoples being excluded. And as a result, we can see this in so much of the literature that we actually still have in our codes, even still today. Resistance to change. Think of the ways in which if my neighbor gets a larger truck, I kind of might not be happy, but then I just kind of get used to it. But if I want to put a little house in the backyard, he, as well as everybody else, has to weigh in on it, gets to decide what kind of cladding I'm using, gets to decide, like, you know, is there going to be 3 windows or 4? Like, this is part of this resistance to change that we've allowed to take place, and the assumption of auto-dependency. And so let's talk about legalizing the next increment by right. This is a key policy proposal that we keep pressing more and more cities to do, and we're seeing some begin to adapt themselves to say you should be allowed to build to the next increment of development. So if it's a duplex, that you can build a 4-plex. If it's a single-family home or single-detached home, that you can build that duplex or a backyard cottage, a 3-unit split, whatever that looks like. And you should be able to do that by right. There's very simple, you walk in at 9 with a 9th grade education, and by noon you can walk out with your building permit. And I've had building officials actually laugh out loud at the concept of that, because they're like, that just doesn't work, that does not fly, but why not? We already devote this land to being used for housing. And then we always say, if you love your existing system so much, allow builders to say we want to skip increments, but then have them go through the whole rigmarole, the whole process. There will be large builders that are going to do that, but many of your small participants in your market are going to do the next thing that comes easiest, the next thing that is necessary within existing neighborhoods. We also want to talk about the idea of productive conservation. For those that are environmentally minded, I would say that productive conservation is the deliberate use of an intensified area or amount of population-serving resources, the land and infrastructure that's needed, in one area of a city's footprint in order to ensure the conservation of resources in other areas. This is directly opposing those that really fight against the introduction of any new housing, even though in their existing neighborhoods it's already been turned from a forest or a field into something that is less than a perfectly natural habitat. And so there will be a great poem for the 3-spotted toad, and yet the realization is that 3-spotted toad is living in their backyard on their asphalt. And you've got to see the challenge of this and embrace the fact that we need to be more productive in the land that we've already set aside for housing. Even as we match our transportation goals with our housing goals, if road expansion incentivizes greenfield development, then do the opposite. Create more walkable places and it incentivizes infill. We see this happening over and over again, and we must take this. Someone asked me last night, what's the first thing that you should do? Eliminate parking minimums. Remove them. I always say there is always going to be a market requirement for parking. So to everybody that's like, oh, you don't want any parking? I'm like, no, I want people to decide how much parking is needed. But the idea that we can, with precision in 18 different categories, identify how much parking is required on thousands of individual sites all across the city, that's madness. That is a complicated system being imposed on something that is actually complex and dynamic. And so as a result, we say there's always going to be a market requirement, which is actually strong towns would say don't even bother with parking maximums. It's an expense of political capital that is not worth the amount of thing, in part because your new number of whatever the maximum is also made up, is also not rooted in some real observation of what the community needs in that place. So I've offended a few of you, but that's okay. We need to normalize lending for ADUs, just make it as easy to get support to build a backyard cottage as it is to get a car loan. Car loans arguably have more of an externality on the rest of the community, and yet it's easy to get that. You walk in, you walk out, away you go. We need to remove minimum lot sizes. This is definitely one of those standards that is rooted in exclusion by class and status. Think of the state of Connecticut, where the zoning library demonstrated the ways in which it was used strategically. We will do 1/4-acre lots, 1/2-acre lots. We want to be a rich and Tony suburb. We're going to do 3/4-acre lots. That way we keep the riffraff, the poor, and the others away. This is something that's so damaging. When subdivisions can no longer be subdivided, we've done something really screwy with our system. We need to allow the next increment to emerge, and part of that is removing all of these arbitrary standards that are in the way. Allowing residential and commercial areas and retail and services in residential areas. Lots of thoughts on that, but I'm going to go into the last little bit here. We need to grow an ecosystem of local developers. This is something that I would say, I mentioned the many projects that are being held because the real estate investment trusts are saying, hey, we can wait for the winds to turn. The Canadian government just dropped their interest rate, or the Bank of Canada did. Interest rates are starting to come down. There's going to be heat coming back into the market because the pressure keeps building. And then we can get the projects that sell at a premium. Many of your small-scale developers, they just get to the point where they need to move on to the next project. So they will sell at the rate that's available, and their margins are very different. Their margins that we see people being instructed in through the work of the Incremental Development Alliance, who can come to your city and coach your small developers, raise up a cohort of people to do this work, to do the work of, I already heard a few people talk about infill. I would say infill is something you get at the dentist. What we actually mean by infill is neighborhood investment. Investing in our existing neighborhoods and doing it for the benefit of not just the individual, but many people in the place. Growing that ecosystem of local developers is core to this. Removing guesswork, this is pre-approved building plans. My friend the architect in the back might say, hey, you're putting me out of work. We always say, no, have the work happen up front and be able to identify all of the barriers to a project being able to go forward, but be able to give those pre-approved building plans to your builders within your community and say, if you build this, you can walk in at 9 with a 9th grade education, leave at noon, knowing that you have a project that's already been approved because it meets the standards that we have. And it can be wonderful. It can be really powerful in our communities. Lastly, we must utilize our funding tools to support the development of entry-level housing units. Remember that bell curve that I showed you? There's a lot of money for single-family homes and tract developments. There's a lot available for 5/1s. There's a lot of money for rich people to build large parcels, even in their own sort of bespoke way. But we really need to bring back a lot of the focus on what it takes to allow entry-level housing. Muskegon, Michigan has done this. They said, hey, we've used TIFs to bring in like Amazon distribution centers and other things that are going to break our heart before too long. We've subsidized Foxconn to come in and ruin Wisconsin, or all sorts of other versions of this. But what they said is we can actually use the amount of tax revenue that we expect a new homeowner to be contributing to the tax revenue to the coffers of the city. We will take that expected increase and use that as a buffer that the homeowner who is looking to purchase a new home or a revitalized home is able to basically take that money and put it towards the purchase, so that the builder still is able to receive what they need in order to break even, but the homeowner is basically receiving a version of a loan from the city based on what the city expects to return in terms of taxes over a 10-year period. Check it out. It's even going to be something that would help in this context here. They are also, in Kalamazoo, they're also funding and supporting contractor training, pre-development and technical assistance, all of these other things. The state of Minnesota has made it possible that through a special assessment, so in a neighborhood, sometimes you have a special assessment because the pipes need to be repaired, and every home is charged, say, $10,000 over 2 years, and so every year they have to make $5,000 payments. Well, you can actually do the same thing where you assign an assessment on, say, the primary property owner, that assessment is going to cover the upfront cost for the construction of a backyard cottage, and the payout, the return of that, is on the property tax bill. So that no matter the consequence, even if the homeowner ends up selling, that payment will still come back to the city over the period of time that it's done. We do that already with roads and with sewers. We can do this even with homes within our community. In Florida, city governments as well as community foundations have said we will co-sign loans. If you as a loanee go bad, we actually probably are going to own your home in a tax sale anyway. So we may as well be the ones that actually backstop what you're doing. There's limited liability for the city because they're already invested in your community. In Kalamazoo, they took their pre-approved building plans to the banks because builders wanted to build them. The bank said, we've not seen any triplexes built. We have no idea how much it's worth. We aren't going to fund this. So the community foundation stepped up and they said, hey, we will build the first examples of these things, make them available through a housing partner, and then we have a market rate assessment of how much they're worth. And next thing you know, people are able to take that parcel and that comp and bring it in and say, this is what this is worth. Now can I get my money to do this? There are so many things that we can do to finance low-cost, high-quality housing. And so we just touched on a lot of stuff. And the reality is this is a thorny, wicked problem that we are facing. Unlocking one lock in this equation doesn't allow the doors to open. It's only when we unlock so many that we will begin to see things change. On this metaphorical door, only one of those is labeled single-family housing zoning. The others are built form regulations, development fees, delays, access to financing, cost of construction, all of these things. And it feels like there can be no progress, or it can feel, as a conversation we were having was, do we just need the government to basically be providing supportive housing to a growing multitude of people? As the threshold of who can qualify in our communities continues to rise, do we have to meet this growing population of people that otherwise cannot afford to be in the places that they're in? But truly, there are so many things that we can be doing together. I'm buoyed by the energy I know is here in this room, the wisdom that you have, the insights that you will bring to this, the strength of groups like Strong Towns SLO, as well as Better SLO, and so many other groups that are tackling this. And so with that, keep at it. It's messy. It sucks that we're in this situation, but it will get better slowly and then significantly. And so thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it tonight. Thank you. You gave a preacher a mic, and then you said, all right, go for it. So, two questions, all right. And this is the resource page if anyone's interested. But yeah, let's do a couple questions, and then I think we will have some time afterwards, corner me afterwards as well. But any questions? Yes?
I think we should announce at the end our Strong.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. There's two here. But I don't know if they're on. Guard your ears if it squeaks. Hey.
Yes. All right, we're looking for two questions.
Yeah. Oh.
Great talk.
Thank you.
Strong for a long time.
Awesome.
A message of adaptation, evolving over time. What is Strong Town's thought on historical preservation related zones?
We should create places that we love, and we should celebrate the things that we love, and we should be careful about tossing everything out just in the name of like a constant quest for growth. Simultaneously, the idea of simply freezing things as a museum piece is counterproductive to the fact that like these have been set aside as places for people to use, to be productive with, to really bring about the benefit of our places. One of the things that we could probably learn from our ancestors in other communities is that they would always retain aspects of the older character or fabric of our places. And I know character is a trigger word for some folks. They're oftentimes what's meant is just a visceral sense of, I want to be able to recognize my place. And if we can maintain those elements, that can go a long ways. Part of the challenge is that people will use, for example, we cannot have more than 3-story buildings because of heritage. And you go back, we actually did this in our community. We went and showed by counting the number of boards on the side of the feed mill, we said this was an 8-story structure. So you're saying that that's the new height limit? And, oh, no. And so the heritage preservation effort is interesting because on the one hand, it meant back in the 60s, the 70s, the preservation of entire neighborhoods from the bulldozer. Understandably, that was a necessary action because highways were being bulldozed through, entire blocks were being wiped away. It has now gotten down to the point where like particular paving stones are being protected, and that is probably the excess. That is probably one of the things that stands in the way. But I often would counsel that if there is an impediment in a particular place because of a historical structure, there are 100 other sites that are probably not, I don't want to say like those are better candidates because maybe you've got to do something with that site. But oftentimes, I'll relate a conversation, and this is for the folks that are in the environmental planning program. We were down in Florida, consulting with communities in Lake County, Florida, and we did 2 sessions. The first was with the environmentalists, and then the second session, which followed, was with the local development community. And the environmentalists were like the protectors of the spotted sage frog, and the protectors of the yellow paintbrush like plant, like very particular, very focused. And they're like, we're so tired of having to protect what belongs to us. We're so tired of preserving what little remains. And so we said, we understand this is why we need more housing in existing neighborhoods. This is why we need to build within our places. Then we had the conversation with the business developer or developers, and the environmentalists were like, can we stay in the room? And we're like, yeah, of course. And the builders were like, we're so tired of building in swamps. We're so tired of building in all of these marginal sensitive areas. We're so tired of Jane over here. She's trying to save what little remains. And we actually wish that we could build in other places. And so this can be one of those moments where historical preservationists should be at the forefront of saying, hey, our community grew. It embraced change and gradual development, even while retaining some of those core recognizable features. Another key part of it is often that private interests are less reliable in the modern context as preservers of heritage development. Lean into your public realm then. If there's something that is of such value, let the public acquire it and let the public be good stewards of it. Turn those things into museums if you wish. But many times when you raise it to that level, they say, well, the paving stone actually isn't that important. And so this can be sometimes a challenge. Big part of it is, where is the battle being fought? It shouldn't be fought at the most particularly emotionally resonant site in your community when you have so many other sitting ducks. So every 7-Eleven site can probably be redeveloped. Every other site that is, even your old community center, the ones that were built when there was little consideration for how is this going to improve the street that it faces, all of those types of things, we can be working with that material. And this is one of the challenges when you have spot zoning or zoning that's so limited, it means that when you draw with your pencil, that border becomes so consequential. Minneapolis said citywide rezoning. St. Louis, citywide upzoning. And the consequence of it is not chaos, but it's a little bit more of that messiness, the emergence of small amounts of housing in various different areas, and that can be really critical. So I don't know who I all offended or how many other people I ran. Yes, one more question.
And quick.
And quick. Oh man, that's impossible. Okay, and Susan, I'll follow up with you right after. Yeah. Oh, question over here.
Was there a question over here?
Oh, otherwise Susan gets the mic. Oh, okay.
Parking.
Yes.
So I get the idea of moving to an area where we don't have parking standards and where people are not too car dependent. And yet in my community where that is the single biggest thing people complain about out of any new development, because their life doesn't work. If they come home from work and late at night and they can't park in their neighborhood, if they can't park when they bring the kids home from school, if they can't park to run into the store, the businesses don't thrive. So how do we move from where we are with a much more parking dependent design to a future that is more walkable, getting from here to there?
Yeah. So we certainly, the core element of it is, as Donald Shoup said, parking is a fertility drug for traffic. And so if you continue to fertilize that impulse to always have the accessible vehicle and the provision of excessive amounts of parking, we see behavior modification happen all the time. People, I actually say with transportation, are remarkably rational. If they're going to go to a Dodgers game, they're going to get on a train to go there because they don't want to pay for the parking is often a deterrent. Well, I mean, Dodgers game might be a little bit of a stretch given you can't even afford the tickets. But in this context, where we will often make those types of short-term determinations, can I find parking there? Do I want to pay for it? So paid parking is going to be part of it. Another irony is that if you're describing people that are living more in suburban style enclaves, they have parking requirements, and for some reason they are defaulting to using the street to satisfy their own parking need, even though the parking requirement that actually caused their house price to be more is a garage that is now used to store granny's furniture and all of these other different types of things. So the parking requirements have not actually even had the root benefit that they would have. One of the ironies and the way to test this and show this is our downtown areas where there's a lot of economic activity are the places that have been most likely to have the parking requirements removed, even though arguably those would be the sites that you would need it the most. You have the most vehicles entering into your downtown area, but they filter out. They filter out into those places. And then another key part of it is how many different types of retail opportunities, small scale, low impact commercial would actually be possible in our existing neighborhoods if we began to relax the parking requirements. There's, your little bakery, your little library. The library board says, hey, maybe we could do a little pop-up library. No, we don't have parking there. We can't do it. We can't authorize it. Every corner lot should be eligible to have any number of other types of uses, and this will not immediately change people's behaviors, but if someone is so vexed by the absence of parking, they will move, or they will simply accommodate their own patterns to go during times when it's not possible. Every time that I hear someone say, there's no parking downtown, I'll say, and did you stay downtown? They're like, yeah. And I'm like, so what did you do? Well, I found parking. And so this is part of the challenge. So that's a glib answer, or a little bit of a short answer. We've got a lot of resources, definitely would recommend checking out. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking you.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.